Hello, listeners. This talk is about the entertainment industry and some of the ways in which it is posing you. There are actually lots and lots of different ways in which the entertainment industry is posing you, and there are many different examples I could explore in terms of television and movies and other forms of pop culture such as music and so on. But I'm only going to talk about a few in this talk. Now, the pause is pretty much omnipresent in both Hollywood and television these days. Surprisingly so in some areas, as you'll discover later on in this talk. I mean, really, try to think of a television series or a really big movie from the past few years that has not been paused and that has not been pushing some sort of progressive political, social, racial, sexual, or many other forms of agenda upon you. Sometimes in quite subtle ways, but often very explicit. In fact, not really pushing it on you, but cramming it down your throat. It's actually pretty hard to think of a major television show or movie where this is not the case. There's usually a sort of a double act that's going on where there are some things that are really in your face. They're sort of way out on the outer edge of posdom. Such as there's a movie, I'm not sure if it's out yet, I've seen ads for it, called The Danish Girl. It's basically about this guy who dresses up as a woman and then he ends up in some sort of homosexual relationship and his wife gets all upset and so on. It's set back in, I think, the 1920s. I have no intention of seeing this movie. It looks completely degenerate. But, you know, this is the latest thing that they're pushing upon people, that guys transitioning into becoming women and then having homosexual relationships. So this is quite standard. This is normal. And, you know, these poor people, society is persecuting them and so on and so forth. This is the current edge of the pause. But then there's also a sort of a lesser level of pause that is pretty much everywhere. It's omnipresent. And that acts to consolidate some of the gains in the culture war and to sort of desensitize you to the pause. And that has the effect of preparing you for the next round of enlightenment or enrichment that's coming with things such as this movie, The Danish Girl, and that kind of thing. The themes that will be discussed in that movie, they're on the edge now, but probably in a decade or so, those will be more part of the mainstream. It really wouldn't surprise me if in the future it's quite standard to have a character who has all sorts of degenerate lifestyle choices. I mean, we've already seen this with homosexuality to some extent, but this whole thing with trans now, that's the next edge of it. And then there'll be something else and something else and something else and so on. And these will gradually move into the mainstream. And so there's that sort of double act there where they do that. Now, we can pretty much take it for granted that anything set in the modern era, so, you know, anything kind of, well, since 1900 onwards pretty much, but especially anything that's sort of from the past few decades or right now, does this. We can also take it for granted that anything that's sort of set in a fantasy world, for instance, Game of Degenerates, as I call it, rather than Game of Thrones, that will have a whole lot of this sort of stuff, because they'll say, well, you know, it's a fantasy world, we can do whatever we want, and, you know, we're so brave, and, you know, all the rest of this nonsense. So we can take it for granted that anything that's set in that kind of world will have this sort of thing, because they'll be all about breaking down the social norms and, you know, well, you know, it's not, we can't take it for given that, for granted that every society would look like ours, you know, all of this stuff, right? All of the usual stuff they say. Likewise with science fiction, and actually I watched a movie recently called Event Horizon, which was from 1997, and it wasn't a good movie. I mean, it was actually a pretty bad movie in terms of the acting and the script writing and so on, and it was very much from the 90s. A lot of the one of the things about science fiction is that, they always try to sort of portray stuff that's going to be in the future, how technology is going to be in the future, and they never really get it right, or it dates very quickly. And so this movie, it has a very 1990s feel in that regard, but it's also just really badly acted and written. I actually read a review a long time ago that said it was an interesting movie, and it wasn't. Don't watch it. But there's actually one little thing in this that I was watching it, and it was a sort of a fairly harmless movie in many ways, although it did have some of those tropes, like the captain of this spaceship, of course, he's black, right? And the attractive blonde white chick doesn't die, right? Of course, like she gets through all of these completely implausible situations, she doesn't die. But there's one thing that sort of triggered me a little bit. So the crew on this spaceship, they're from different countries, primarily the US and the UK, although the interesting thing is they wear these patches on their sleeves, on their left sleeve, with a flag of some description. So the Americans have an American flag on there. The British characters all had these kind of EU type flags. They were different to the modern EU. They had sort of like 40 or 50 stars. I don't know where all of these extra countries were coming from, but nevertheless, they had EU patches instead of British patches. And then one of the main characters is played by Sam Neill, who's actually from New Zealand originally, but he's supposedly Australian. There are a number of these guys, like Russell Crowe's also in that situation, and there are a few other people also. So he had an Australian flag on there, but there was something I sort of caught glimpses of it from different angles, and there was something that was kind of strange about it, and I was thinking, what's going on with that flag? I couldn't see the flag properly, and then there was a proper shot of his arm. It was an Australian flag without the Union Jack. It had an Aboriginal flag instead of the Union Jack in the top left corner, of course, right? So, even in the 90s, they were pushing all sorts of subtle, posy things back then. So, we can take it for granted that anything that's set in the modern era, or anything that's sort of science fiction or fantasy, will have pos at some level. And this evidently goes back, I'm sure we could find examples before 1997 as well. But, it's been building up for a while. Likewise, we can take it for granted that anything that is set in the ancient world, particularly the Greeks and the Romans, will also have all sorts of pos, particularly sexual pos, because as we all know, the only legacy or the only contribution to world civilization or humanity or whatever from the Romans and the Greeks was sexual debauchery, and specifically the invention of the orgy. Forget about everything else. The Greeks, mathematics and science and architecture and all of this sort of stuff. That's sort of not really worth anything, and they probably stole that from someone anyway. But the Romans and the Greeks are most famous for homosexuality and inventing the orgy. So, we can sort of take it for granted that anything that's set in those times will also have lots of pos also. But I want to talk about a few of the more ridiculous examples that I've witnessed in recent years. Of course, there are probably some that I've forgotten, and I'm sure some of you will mention these in the comments beneath this video. But as I mentioned just a minute ago, anything set in the modern world is fair game. Yet even things that you would think that are pretty safely off limits, they're also fair game. So I'm talking about historical, mythological worlds of the West and white people. So I'm going to give you two sort of mythological or mythical examples and two actual kind of historic examples. So the mythological examples are The Hobbit and Thor, the movie Thor. And the historic examples are Vikings, and I guess that's also covered in Thor, and War and Peace. All right, so I'll begin with The Hobbit. Now, Peter Jackson, the director of both the Lord of the Rings series and the Hobbit series, the recent Hobbit series, he always seems to put some strange non-Tolkien scenes or subplots that don't really need to be there. They don't drive the story. They're just sort of, they pop up and you're sort of like, well, why are they in there? And he has done this in both the Lord of the Rings and also the Hobbit series. So, for instance, in the original Lord of the Rings series, in the second one, the Two Towers, there's that scene where what's his name, Aragorn, goes over a cliff and floats down the river. There's a scene that's not from the book where he and a whole bunch of other guys battle these warg riders, and then he disappears, and what's her name? Is it Eowyn? I think that's her name. The daughter of the king of the Rohan. She's worried for him and all of this stuff. And this is just before the Battle of the Hornburg, also known as the Battle of Helm's Deep. And it has nothing to do with the original book. It's not in there. He just put that in there. I don't know why, just for an extra action scene or something. But I want to talk about the really bizarre sort of quasi-romance between two characters in the second of it. Maybe it's just these second movies. He goes off script in the second movie in each case. The second of the Hobbit movies, the Desolation of Smaug. So there's this sort of quasi-romance type thing between an elf, Tauriel, and a dwarf, Kili. And look, there are all sorts of other issues with Tauriel. She's sort of actually the very embodiment of the kick-ass pixie chick. There's this trope of these little women. They're tiny. They're sort of half the size of the average guy, but they know all sorts of martial arts, or they can fight with multiple weapons, and they take on hordes of enormous guys and beat them to a pulp, right? So she's sort of the embodiment of that trope, literally, the kick-ass pixie chick, right? But there's this bizarre relationship between her and this dwarf, where it never really sort of gets consummated in any way, but they sort of look at each other with longing eyes and all this sort of stuff, right? Between her, she's an elf, and this dwarf, Kili. And it's really strange, firstly, because it's not in the works of Tolkien. I've read both The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, but I went and looked this up because I know he's written all sorts of other stuff. There's that other book, what's it called, the Silmarillion or something like that. Maybe I'm getting the name wrong. Where it sort of goes into the whole history and mythology of Middle Earth. So I thought maybe it's mentioned in there. So I went and looked this up, and it's not. So, it's kind of a bizarre thing. Why did he put that in there, right? I mean, it's sort of like this interracial romance, this subtext for that. It's a strange thing, especially because certainly culturally elves and dwarves are completely incompatible. But I guess it's this modern thing of, well, we're all compatible. We're all humans or something, although, we're all elves and dwarves or something, right? We're all just one species or whatever, right? So we should all get along. And I guess there's a kind of a multicultural subtext there as well. And he sort of has some of those other things in the movies. Like I don't remember in the book or the books of Lord of the Rings there being that sort of bromance between Legolas and Gimli. But that's really played up. If it exists, I can't remember if it does or not. But that's really played up in those Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies. So there's that whole sort of subtext of multiculturalism and so on. But also the possibility of this relationship between Tauriel and Kili, which never gets consummated or anything. It's improbable because dwarves and elves are quite likely physically incompatible, sexually incompatible, and so on. I mean, it's a strange thing, and I really think that Peter Jackson jumped the shark with the Hobbit trilogy. I mean, it was a painful series to watch in all sorts of ways. Mostly, sort of the fact that it was dragged into a 3-movie series, a trilogy out of one small book. But you would think that with a figure like Tolkien, who is, firstly he was a professor of all sorts of languages, including a lot of ancient European languages, and he knew an enormous amount about the mythology and history and so on of various European peoples. I mean, he was this incredibly knowledgeable person, a real authority on all of these sort of things. And then, of course, he wrote these books that are beloved in the Western canon, and pretty much created the concept of fantasy, specifically high fantasy. I mean, you'd think that with a figure like that, you'd leave him well enough alone. It would be like saying you're going to play some Beethoven, but you're going to make some improvements. I mean, why would you do that? You know, the hubris involved is incredible. But, you know, apparently, you know, it's the modern age. It's, I don't know, it's this postmodernism or something that, you know, no, it's okay to actually improve upon Tolkien, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, it's bizarre, right? And of course, part of this also is because Tolkien's entire Middle-earth universe and mythology and so on, being as it is based upon ancient European mythology, cultures, languages, and so on and so forth. I mean, you know, he invented the languages that various groups of people speak, and those are all based upon, I mean, the languages are internally consistent and so on, but they're also based upon European languages and so on. You know, the guy was really clever. But all of those things are pretty much the archetype of whiteness. And that's why it's interesting to watch liberals who are very much into these things like Tolkien or the Game of Degenerates or whatever. They're very much into this sort of LARPing whiteness, because I think those things are in some ways a safe outlet for whiteness. But, you know, even these things are not off limits. They're not safe anymore. And also, of course, Tolkien was a very old school Christian conservative, if not a complete reactionary, certainly against the modern world and the changes that were occurring in the United Kingdom at that time. And, you know, he's very much against industrialization and all of this sort of stuff. You know, why the need to change his canon and insert an interracial relationship or you know, all these multicultural themes and, you know, all this sort of stuff. I mean, I say this as someone who is sort of involved in an interracial relationship, and I kind of live a multicultural life in a sense, being an expat and all of this sort of stuff. But, you know, why do all of these things, these sort of holy texts or the canon or whatever, have to be paused, right? Well, we know the answer to that, because, you know, you can't have nice things, right? You know, white people can't have their nice things. Everything has to be changed in some way. Now, speaking about sort of the whitest of the white, you know, white, you know, sort of the ultimate in capital W, white culture, this brings me to the whole pantheon of the Vikings. And Tolkien was into the Vikings as well. But, and you might say that the Rohan in Lord of the Rings, you know, they're sort of based upon the Vikings to some extent. All right, so let's begin with Thor, the movie Thor, based upon the, I think it's Marvel, or is it DC? I think it's Marvel, comic universe. So this was a movie from 2011. Now, of course, this is based upon the comic book, which was created by Stan Lee and others who echo in a big way. So, you know, that might be some indication of where this is coming from. But of course, people will say, well, you know, it's a comic, it's open to artistic license and so on and so forth. And I think some of you have already guessed where I'm going with this. So, you know, this movie, I mean, it's a stupid action movie, right? You know, a bunch of muscled up, roided up dudes, you know, jumping around and doing whatever. Okay, cool, whatever, right? And it's sort of whatever, you can look at that as sort of popcorn, throwaway culture, whatever. So I remember watching this, and this was before I was a lot more red-pilled. So I was watching this movie, and of course, some of you know what I'm getting towards. One of the gods of Asgard is the sort of the realm of the gods in Norse mythology. It's where all of these sort of uber-Aryan gods live. One of them, in the original pantheon, he was called Heimdallr. I don't know exactly how you pronounce his name. So he formed the inspiration for a character in the this comic universe called Heimdall. So in the movie, he's played by Idris Elba, who's a black man. And I remember watching this, you know, and I wasn't red-pilled at the time on a lot of these things, and having one of those moments like, what the hell's going on here? right? Like here, the main guy is played by, I think it's one of those Australian guys, Chris Hemsworth or Helmsworth, I don't know, something like that. Who's this sort of big, chisel-faced, blonde Australian guy, right? Okay, whatever, like he's this Viking god, right? I think you get to, there's this Norse god who's black. What the hell is going on? I remember thinking, what? Now, I suppose there is perhaps some tenuous connection in that in Norse mythology, Heimdall is described as having gold teeth. So I don't know, maybe that was the inspiration for making him black. But it was a weird situation in that movie. It was very incongruous with the whole concept of Vikings as being these uber blonde Aryan people, and their gods would be reflective of that, and so on and so forth. I mean, none of these people would ever have seen a black person, right? So anyway, that's that. Now we get to the television series Vikings. I don't know if any of you have seen this. It's an Irish-Canadian production that began in 2013 and it's now into its 4th season with a 5th season already slated for next year. So I think I watched the entire first series. I may have watched a little bit less or a little bit more. I can't remember. I got about halfway through the series and I was starting to get distracted, so I was surfing the internet or something at the same time, and I sort of wasn't watching it that keenly after a while. I mean, being sort of a very what's the word? Like a Swipple kind of person in some ways. I love anything that's sort of a period piece, anything that has white people in period costumes with swords or non-modern weaponry, essentially, cannons, whatever, guys on horses, all of that stuff. I love that stuff, right? It's like that sort of stuff is like it's a magnet for white people, I think. So, I started watching this series thinking, oh great, this is going to be fantastic. White guys running around with swords, awesome. And ships with dragon heads and stuff, fantastic, right? I lost interest somewhere through it, and I was watching it half-heartedly because there are all these sort of too many silly side plots with females and female drama. I don't care about who's romantic with whom, or all of that nonsense. And also that whole rivalry between the two brothers, I think their names are Ragnar and Rollo, that sort of left me cold as well. But too much drama, not enough swords, essentially. But of course, this it got progressively worse too, and I think I tuned out because they hit all the usual tropes. So for instance, I think it's who is it? Is it Ragnar's wife? I think it's Ragnar's wife. This blonde chick. She probably weighs like 50 kilos, 55 kilos, whatever, right? She's this little blonde chick, and she, of course, she has the whole kick-ass pixie chicks fighting off multiple men twice her size thing going on, swinging around, doing these implausible moves, cartwheels and pirouettes and all of this sort of stuff, whilst wielding 2 swords or battle axes, or, just ridiculous stuff that no one would do anyway, but certainly not a woman, and certainly not against a bunch of guys, right? But, all that sort of stuff, right? The usual. I mean, that's pretty much de rigueur for anything that's modern, that has women in it, fighting, the kung fu masters and all the other stuff. And for anyone who has ever done any martial arts or anything like that, it's completely ridiculous, right? I used to do judo as a teenager, and there was one woman at our club, and I think she was an Australian champion, and she went to the Olympics a few times, and she also did triathlons and all of this other stuff. And she was really fit for a woman, and she was really strong. Like, she could bench press more than her body weight and all of this sort of stuff, right? And she was older than I was. She had the same birthday as me. She was 5 years older than I was, right? So I was a teenager, and everyone, including me, could wipe the floor with her. And she would sort of, jump around and prance about. And at some point she'd say to you, come on, you're not trying, like, try harder. Right, and you go like, oh, I'm not trying because I'm going to destroy you if I try. No, come on. So then you go, all right, okay, whatever, bang, right? And you go, what are you doing? I'm just this little woman, right? Why are you being rough with me? She would do all this sort of stuff, right? But anyone who has actually had any real experience in doing martial arts or anything like that with women knows it's an absolute nonsense when you see one of these movies with some little chick jumping about doing whatever, right? But of course, there's all that. The thing I want to talk about though with Vikings, and I haven't seen this because I think that the show sort of jumped the shark within the first season, and I didn't watch anything after that, or maybe I watched 1 or 2 episodes half-heartedly of the second season. The thing I want to talk about is I read recently, I just saw this thing and read a couple of articles about it. There's a Chinese character in this show now, right? I mean, just wrap your head around that, all right? It's about Vikings, like this sort of the very archetype of white dudes with blonde hair and white culture and so on. Vikings. I mean, like Romans, you could say, oh, they took slaves from other parts of the world, whatever, right? But Vikings with the Chinese character. I mean, not even like an African character. I mean, they've done that trope to death, so now they've got a Chinese character, right? And so the theory behind this, I read about this. So of course what they did was they asked some professor or something, might this have been possible? And they're sort of like, well, maybe there's a 1% chance of this happening. Oh, well, then it definitely happened, all right? So here's the story behind this Chinese character. Supposedly she was captured somehow and taken as a slave to the Middle East, from whence she was sold on to Paris as a slave. And of course she gets captured when the Vikings attack Paris, right? So that's how implausibly they get a Chinese character in Norway or Sweden. I don't know how that makes sense, right? But just because it's like, I don't know if any of you have seen that movie. I think it's Dumb and Dumber. It's one of those Jim Carrey movies, and he plays this buffoon, and he has the hots for some chick, and he says to her, do you think there's a chance between the two of us? And she says, she's trying not to hurt his feelings, so she says, 1 in a million. And he gets this look, and you think he's about to be really upset, and then he breaks into this big grin, and he's saying, so you're saying there's a chance, right? She's basically saying no, but she's trying to be polite, and so she thinks, well, 1 in a million, he's going to take the hint. Of course he doesn't. So, they went to some history professor. Might it have been possible that a Chinese slave might have ended up in Norway? Well, I'm not going to rule it out. Oh, well, it definitely happened, right? So I have a great plot device actually for the next season. I know how they can take this one step further. They can actually take this to a new height. They should have an Australian Aborigine. And here's how they're going to get this character in the next series of the Vikings, right? What's going to happen is they'll I don't know whether they'll have some flashbacks or what, or maybe this will be told. The character will explain where he or she is from. So the Australian Aborigine one day is fishing on the shore in the Northern Territory, and somehow gets washed out to sea, and a big wave comes and knocks the Aborigine off a rock or something, and he ends up drifting out to sea. He clings to a log. It gets carried on some sort of epic at least 6 month journey, and of course it wouldn't explain how he actually survived that, but somehow he gets carried across the Indian Ocean, around the southern tip of Africa, up through the Atlantic, the North Seas, and then he washes up on the shore of Norway, and he's found by some Vikings and adopted. And that's how you end up with an Australian Aborigine in Vikings, because they've already jumped the shark by having a Chinese character, or you could have a similar thing. Maybe an Incan falls down off the edge of a mountain and down off the Andes, ends up in the Brazilian rainforest somehow, and then floats down the Amazon River, and again, washes out to sea and ends up, going up through the Atlantic, the North Sea, and then washing up on the shore of Norway. And that's how you get an Incan. I mean, you could have all of these characters in your Vikings television show. I mean, it's completely ridiculous, and it just all of this sort of stuff. I try not to get triggered by it, but sometimes I just think, just fuck off. Just fuck off with this bullshit. It's so annoying. It's so stupid. The Vikings were white. I don't want to see a single television show, movie, anything else about Vikings where they're not all blonde, or perhaps ginger, although ginger people are kind of evil, so maybe not ginger. But anything about Vikings that has anyone who is not pasty, blonde, and has eyes that look like ice cubes. No, fucking no. Just fuck off. And this sort of stuff, it annoys the hell out of me that they do this. And of course, that's why they do it, right? Because they know that they're triggering all these white guys out there. And they're actually sort of inserting this subtly so that, some 14-year-old kid or 15-year-old kid or whatever who goes to school and knows nothing about history, because of course school doesn't teach you anything about history other than white people were evil. And he thinks, well, yeah, there were Chinese Vikings, right? Because I saw it on TV, right? And so, it's all a sort of a subtle way to undermine everything about our history, our culture, our mythology, you name it. It all has to be paused, and it's just, chipping away, blonde chicks fighting guys twice their size, Chinese Vikings, you name it, right? Chipping away, right? Finally, we get to War and Peace, and I'm specifically talking about a BBC production from this year, or it was released this year, 2016, and I just stumbled upon this recently, and I watched this. I binge watched the whole series. It was awesome in many ways, right? And I should mention that before I continue, War and Peace is one of my favorite books. I read it I think about 5 years ago. It took me a while to read it. It's a pretty long book, and I was so sort of impressed with this book that I named one of my dogs. I adopted a dog a few months later. I named one of my dogs after one of the principal characters in War and Peace, right? So I have this dog with this LARPy Russian name, and it's even spelt in the sort of LARPy Russian transliteration of that. And people rave about War and Peace as being one of the greatest books ever written, and so on and so forth. It's all true. It's a phenomenal book. I love that book. So, I discovered this recent BBC series, and I thought, oh, great, awesome. People in costumes, white dudes riding horses, fantastic. And I should say, first of all, that this TV miniseries, it's a 6-part miniseries. It should probably actually be retitled Mostly English People LARPing as Russians, because implausibly there's not a single Russian surname amongst any of the minor actors even, let alone the major actors. The entire cast virtually is English there, except for the principal character, Pierre Bezukov. He's played by an American, that guy Paul Dano, who was in There Will Be Blood, and he was good in that. He's good in this too. And then there are a couple of other non-English actors in there, but they're mostly English, right? There's not even like some random dude with a Russian surname. They're all English, right? And it's a really sort of LARPy English production when there's someone with the most improbable name I've ever heard. Her name is Tuppence Middleton, which is sort of like this archetypal LARPy middle-class English name, Tuppence. I mean, what sort of name is Tuppence? Does she have a sister called 2 shillings and 6pence? But it's sort of like this. It's this LARPy kind of English production. It's really good. I largely enjoyed this series, this mini-series. The set design, the costumes, all of that stuff, absolutely exquisite. And the story is pretty faithful to the book. It doesn't include everything in the book, but it's pretty good. The writing and acting were fairly good also. But sort of quite British, rah-rah, sort of, period piece, their take on things. And they're sort of like a couple of the characters were not quite how I thought they were in the book, like the father of the Bolgonsky family. He's a much more likable character. He's sort of funny as well. He didn't come off that way to me in the book. But anyway, it's fairly good, right? And also I'm actually really amazed at this because this is sort of a trope in modern BBC productions where they'll have a period piece and they'll have non-white actors in a British period piece. They actually don't go down that route, So Pierre Bezukov wasn't black, and Natalia Rostova wasn't Pakistani, right? So you think, all right, so what could go wrong, right? It's white people, British accents, LARPy costumes, the whole bit, right? Fantastic. What could go wrong? So one thing that I've noticed, and it may predate this, but I really noticed it in the HBO series Rome. Some of you may remember that. There are actually 2 series. Is that a lot of modern television shows now have sex scenes or nudity, often for absolutely no apparent reason. Like someone will come in to talk to someone. Okay, we have to plan this major historic battle. I've come to talk to you about this. Well, let me just finish my orgy. That sort of thing. Like, was that actually necessary there? Right? Why? A lot of this is just for the general pause and the titillation. So there are a few sex scenes in One Piece, not as many as in other things, and they're not quite as gratuitous. And they involve the character of Helene Bezukova, who is the principal character's wife, and she's this scheming, cheating, horrible woman. And she's actually played by the aforementioned Tuppence Middleton. I love that name, Tuppence. Who names their kid Tuppence? But there was one really strange scene in the miniseries. It was really incongruous, this scene. It stood out like a sore thumb. So one of the principal characters is a guy called Andrei Bolkonsky. He's sort of he goes on this whole spiritual journey and all this sort of stuff as well. And he's trying to find himself, and he's meant to be a sort of an archetypal kind of aristocratic character and all this stuff. And he's in the Russian army, and various things happen to him. So there's one scene where this is during the Napoleonic campaign in 1812. So he's trying to find out some information. He's trying to get a message or something. So he rides up on his horse, and he comes upon a large number of Russian soldiers, and they're bathing in a lake or a river or something. And so there are all these guys, they're up to their waists in water, they've got their backs to whatever, right? So he rides up, and then this guy comes out of the water to talk to him, and when this guy comes out, it's shot as a full frontal nudity shot. The guy has 1 or 2 lines, and then you never hear or see from him again. In fact, I don't even think he's a named character. I can't remember this at all from the book. But this dude, he just has 1 or 2 lines, but he's essentially there because they wanted to see his dick, right? I don't want to see some guy's dick randomly. I mean, look, I've seen porn and all of that sort of stuff, right? But when I just wanted to watch something about dudes with sabers and cannons and riding horses and fancy uniforms and stuff, right? And about this spiritual journey of various characters. I don't remember Tolstoy mentioning any penises in this seminal work of world literature, not just Western literature, but world literature. It's ranked up there as one of the greatest things, the greatest examples of pen put to paper in history. I don't remember Tolstoy even just throwing in a casual penis reference. I do remember him discussing all sorts of philosophical and spiritual concepts, and you could perhaps say Pierre Bezukhov, for instance, is a sort of a somewhat autobiographical character about Tolstoy, and he tries to help his serfs and educate them, and Tolstoy, I believe, eventually got excommunicated from the Orthodox Church because he went off on this whole other tangent about spirituality. And Pierre Bezukhov is kind of a vehicle for all of that stuff. And then Tolstoy goes into considerable length later in the book criticizing the great man theory of history, talking about Napoleon and his role in this bigger sort of epoch and all of this stuff. Sometimes it goes into these wild digressions that sort of step out of the book, and they're just pure philosophy. So he went into all this really deep, intense stuff. A lot of that doesn't get shown in or even discussed in the miniseries. Some of the stuff to do with Pierre's spiritual growth is covered. But it doesn't go into this whole thing about Napoleon and dismissing the great man theory of history, yet we get a random penis instead. I mean, as I said, I've seen porn and all of this stuff. I'm not frightened or offended or anything like that by random penis. It's just the incongruity of it all. That, there's all this development of character and spirituality, and these people are sort of gnashing their teeth and wringing their hands over their existential crises and all this stuff, and then it's in this backdrop of one of the greatest novels ever written, with talking about history, the grand sweep of history, and these incredibly intricate personal relationships. The character list and all of the different relationships, who's related to whom and who does what with whom, and all of this sort of stuff is really complex. But just like throwing a random penis in there instead. Now, it might just be that some of this is pure titillation. I think they have a couple of breasts in there as well. So it might just be that at one level, firstly, in any modern show, maybe this rates, maybe that's why they have all this random stuff in Game of Degenerates or in the Rome series, because, basically people want to see nudity, and maybe even sex scenes, right? So maybe this stuff gets put in there just because they want it to be hip, modern, and to rate well, and all of that sort of stuff. I don't know. I mean, it seems pretty jarring to me, given the overall sort of aspirations to high culture and the set design and all of that sort of stuff. It's really beautifully shot and all that. It seemed jarring given the overall tenor of the show otherwise. So I don't know. And it might also be that if you had female nudity, you'd get all these complaints. So they think, well, we have to show some male nudity. And of course, penis is not equivalent to breasts, but, they have to show something, I guess. So they do. I mean, you might ask, well, why is it even necessary to have female nudity? I don't know. Maybe it rates well, as I said. But, at another level, you would think that somehow you would be safe with something like War and Peace. You would expect lots of gold brocade and velvet settees and men with sideburns and women with impossibly ornate hairstyles and, all of that stuff. All as a backdrop to a deep exploration of the human condition by one of the greatest minds that has ever lived, right? I mean, that's what the book is, right? It's this at some points it sort of takes this wide angle view of history and these battles and politics and all of this stuff. And then at other points it really kind of zooms down to a microscopic level, looking at the relationships within a particular family and just daily life. There's one of my favorite scenes in the book is one where they go hunting. They're out of their country estate. The Rostov family are out of their country estate and they go hunting. And they get all the dogs ready and all this stuff and they go off hunting. And it's just it's a real, because the Rostov family, they're all really close. They're kind of, the father's a bit of a doofus, right? But the Rostov family are all really close and really loving and all of this stuff. And, it's this, Tolstoy really captures all of this sort of, these aspects of daily Russian life and this sort of stuff really well. And they have that scene in the miniseries. It's pretty good, that scene as well. But there's actually another scene that's fantastic where they're singing and dancing. They're staying with some really poor relatives in another part of the countryside, all in this tiny little farmhouse. And they start singing and dancing, and Natasha, she starts dancing and doing this Russian dance, and it's sort of the lighting is kind of subdued, and people are singing in Russian and all this sort of stuff. It's fantastic. I love that sort of stuff in television shows and movies. So you've got all of this sort of stuff, right? Beautiful, awesome, fantastic, right? Plus all of these deeper issues to do with spirituality, and both not just Pierre, but some of the other characters as well go through this sort of spiritual transformation, and he's talking about social issues and theories of history and all of this stuff, right? And then just a random dick in there. Why? And actually, my wife suggested to me after we watched this, she was really impressed as well. She went and watched The the whole thing. She watched part of it with me, and I'd already watched part of it, so she went back and watched that as well. She was really impressed. So she suggested that we make a copy and give it to a friend of ours, a Taiwanese friend, who is a music teacher, and she's somewhat cultured and so on, and that she could watch it with her 9-year-old daughter. They do everything together, this mother and her daughter. I mean, aside from the fact that the kid probably wouldn't understand a lot of it, I don't know, maybe she would have liked the imagery and so on. There's a random dick in there. I can just imagine this woman with her kid watching it. Oh, look at that wallpaper, how lovely. That antique vase, magnificent. Oh, don't those men riding horses look grand? Aunts Pierre and Andre, really interesting characters. Mummy, what's that? Then, the following week, I ask this woman, so what did you and your daughter think of War and Peace? Yeah, thanks for the dick pics for my daughter, right? Like even this, War and Peace, there has to be the pause in War and Peace, just because you can't have nice things, guys, you can't have nice things, right? Even War and Peace has to have the pause. War and pause. That's what they should have called it, not English people LARPing as Russians. War and pause. In fact, I think I'm going to name this video. I had a different title for it. I'm going to name this one War and Pause. All right, so this is why I say don't watch most of what comes out of the entertainment industry. 99% of it, you're not even safe watching something like War and Peace, right? Because it becomes War and Pause. Or shows about ancient white history or mythology. Vikings, you can't watch Vikings because they're not Vikings, dude. They're just, it's a Canadian-Irish co-production. So, Canada's not a white country, guys. So, got to have some non-Anglo-Celtic people in there, because Canada's not a white country, it's a multicultural country, So, to one degree or another, this pause is shoved down your throat in everything. Can't have shows about white guys with swords or cannons, The way to escape this nonsense is not to watch it, and perhaps do something useful like read the actual books or other books, I would highly recommend reading War and Peace. It's a fantastic book. It's everything that people say it is and more. It blew my mind. But also, of course, because all of these things are a complete time sink. These movies and television shows, they're lowbrow. Like they're really pitched at the lowest common denominator. Having pixie white chicks fighting with battle axes is lowest common denominator stuff. I actually read the other day that the average American watches 5 hours of television per day, and it dips in teenage years, and then after teenage years, so from 20s onwards, it continues to climb for the rest of people's lives, such that old people watch 7 hours. But here's the one that really blew me. Black people watch 7 hours of television per day. I thought, how is that even possible? I guess a lot of them aren't employed. But yeah, the average American watches 5 hours of television per day. That's insane. Even without the pause, that would be a huge time sink. But people are literally poisoning their minds, and more so the minds of their children, with the degeneracy coming out now. Because it's not just fantastic, it's anti-historical. Much of it is downright anti-historical. And the pause is in everything. You watch War and Peace. Oh, lovely. Guys riding horses, talking about history, and women in chambers, playing the piano. And there's a random dick in there. Why? It's everywhere, this stuff, and it's such a waste of time because it's so dumb. So turn off the idiot box. And I know I have a number of neat subscribers. And I'm sure many of you have already watched and raved about the I think it's the first episode of Game of Degenerates has come out, right? I think the second one's coming out this weekend or something. I haven't watched the first one. I'm not going to watch that show. In fact, I'm trying not to watch any television now. over the past few years, I've perhaps watched only a few hours a week of television or movies, but maybe even that is too much. You know, I'm trying to turn off the idiot box. I don't think I'm going to watch any more television series from now on. They're just an insult to my intelligence, to anyone's intelligence actually, and they're really degenerate. You know, a while ago I made a similar appeal. I made a video about people playing video games and how and why they shouldn't. And actually this year, other than some online crosswords or Sudoku puzzles, I haven't played any video games so far this year, and I'm all the better for it, because those things are a complete time sink. Well, probably most television and most movies are also a time sink, and they're poison. So as with video games, I would suggest turn off the idiot box. Don't watch it. It's bad for you. It's degenerate. We should know this as reactionaries, as people on the alt-right. We should know this. And, you know, it's a bit like saying I'm going to drive a car without wearing my seatbelt because an accident is not going to happen to me. Maybe. People still have accidents, though. Those people didn't set out that morning. They didn't wake up and think, you know what, I think I'll have a car accident today. That'll be fun. They didn't think they were going to have an accident either. And so you're playing with fire, watching all of this paused nonsense, because at some level it will seep in. I mean, that's why they do it, right? They don't, you know, none of this is random. That's why they do it. The people who make these things, that's why they put this stuff in, because they know at some level it seeps into you. You internalize it. It becomes how you think about the world. So anyway, that's the end of the talk. Thank you for listening, and if you have any comments, please write them beneath this video.